The world is witnessing a dramatic pivot in American foreign policy, a move that substitutes cautious diplomacy with an immediate public threat of military intervention. This is not a policy designed by geopolitical strategists. It is a decisive, high-stakes gamble driven by political expediency. Trump has seized upon the complex, tragic issue of intercommunal violence in Nigeria to issue a clear military ultimatum, demanding that the nation's government act decisively or face a U.S. intervention. This is FPV Explainer, where we break down the most fascinating stories in drone warfare and global affairs, including critical analyses of U.S. domestic politics. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling us what topic you want to see next. Your feedback shapes our future videos and keeps us bringing you clear, detailed analysis from the front lines. Also, please watch this video to the very end, even if you play it in the background without sound, as your continuous viewing is critical to help promote the truth about the war. The core of this unprecedented move is Trump's explicit public command to his Department of War to prepare forces for potential entry into Nigeria. This formal military posturing is a transparent effort to demonstrate resolve to his domestic political base. Trump's rhetoric has framed the entire security crisis in Nigeria, a nation of over 210 million people facing violence often rooted in ethnic conflicts and competition for resources, as a singular ideological conflict, the persecution of our great Christian community. By declaring Nigeria a country of particular concern, Trump is positioning himself as the singular global defender of conservative, faith-based interests. This strategy is pure political theater. While the situation in Nigeria is dire, Trump's framing of the crisis is deliberately narrow. His warnings ignore the complexity of the violence, which affects both Muslim and Christian populations, choosing instead to focus only on the narrative that mobilizes his base. The explicit command to the Department of War is a signal designed for domestic consumption. If the Nigerian government continues to allow the murder of Christians, the U.S. will immediately cease all aid and may very well enter this now disgraced country with guns drawn to totally destroy the Islamic terrorists committing these horrific atrocities. The message is clear. He is ready, willing, and able to deploy force. This maneuver effectively weaponizes human rights rhetoric for political gain. Trump is leveraging the genuine fear and grief over the violence to cement his image as a decisive and morally absolute leader, a contrast to perceived weakness on the world stage. The ultimatum forces the Nigerian government into an impossible position: either implement sweeping, potentially destabilizing internal security measures to satisfy Trump's demands, or risk the withdrawal of crucial U.S. support and face the terrifying prospect of a U.S. military intervention. This is a high-stakes ideological gamble that risks global instability for the sake of domestic political theater.
We have analyzed the explicit ultimatum delivered by Trump, but a true strategic assessment requires looking beyond the stated, righteous objective of protecting Christians and confronting the probable hidden geopolitical and economic goals driving this aggressive policy toward Nigeria. This potential intervention is far more complex than a simple counterterrorism measure. It is a high-stakes gambit that seeks to establish dominance over a crucial African powerhouse. The official rhetoric, focusing solely on the persecution of a religious minority, serves as the ideal public justification for Trump's interventionist impulses. However, the true targets are almost certainly economic and geopolitical. Nigeria is not just the most populous country in Africa, it is the continent's largest oil producer and a critical strategic node. Gaining influence or control over Nigeria's vast energy resources and its access to regional markets would represent a massive strategic win for the U.S. that would instantly shift global financial dynamics. This interest in the energy sector suggests that the Crusade is, at its core, an oil calculation disguised as a humanitarian rescue mission. Trump's administration has demonstrated in other theaters its readiness to use security concerns as a pretext for regime change, and the potential reward in Nigeria's oil fields makes this scenario highly probable. Furthermore, the threatened intervention is about geopolitical dominance in Africa. The continent has become a new, contested arena for global influence, with major rivals like China and Russia aggressively expanding their economic and military footprints. By intervening decisively in Nigeria, Trump would not only be addressing a security issue, but would be asserting U.S. primacy in a critical region, sending a powerful and unambiguous message to both Moscow and Beijing that America is willing to use hard power to protect its interests and influence. The goal is to prevent Nigeria from slipping further into the economic or military orbits of the U.S.'s primary rivals. The threatened military scenario reinforces this reading. Trump's ultimatum promises an attack that will be swift, brutal, and decisive, language straight from the playbook of regime decapitation rather than complex, long-term counterinsurgency. This is the hallmark of a plan designed for minimum duration and maximum political impact. Rapid aerial strikes to eliminate the most visible terrorist cells, followed by a potential commitment of special operations forces to target key militant leadership and infrastructure. This approach minimizes the risk of the U.S. military becoming bogged down in a costly long-term occupation. However, the reality of Nigeria, with its immense population, diverse internal conflicts, and powerful regional militias, like Boko Haram, suggests that such an intervention, even if executed quickly, carries an enormous risk. The true strategic danger is that the military action, framed as a surgical strike against terrorists, will instead lead to the systemic destabilization of the region, creating a power vacuum that could be exploited by the very groups Trump claims to be fighting. The historical pattern of U.S. interventions in complex foreign theaters suggests that what begins as a swift, clean operation often devolves into an unforeseen quagmire. This potential intervention is therefore a high-stakes foreign policy gambit driven by a powerful blend of economic interests, geopolitical competition, and domestic political messaging.
We have analyzed the external threat posed by Trump. Now we must address the legitimate diplomatic and strategic consequences from the target nation itself. The question facing the international community is whether Trump's unilateral military action is a genuine attempt at protection or a profound violation of national sovereignty that guarantees greater chaos. The official response from Abuja was immediate, firm, and based on constitutional principles, directly confronting Trump's ideological framing of the crisis. Bola Ahmed Tinubu, the President of the Federal Republic of Nigeria, issued a public statement unequivocally rejecting the accusation of religious intolerance. His defense was rooted in the nation's legal identity, asserting that Nigeria stands as a constitutional democracy built on fundamental guarantees of religious freedom. Tinubu argued that the crisis is being misrepresented. The violence, while tragic, stems not from state persecution, but from complex inter-ethnic conflicts and the desperate struggle over limited resources in regions like the Middle Belt, a geographical reality that precedes and transcends the current political rivalry. He stressed that the government is actively engaged in addressing security issues affecting citizens of all faiths, implicitly stating that Trump's interventionist rhetoric ignores this complexity and disrespects the nation's ongoing, sincere efforts. This diplomatic resistance is critical because the consequences of a unilateral U.S. intervention are catastrophic and unpredictable. Nigeria is the most populous country in Africa, a nation of over 210 million people with hundreds of distinct ethnic groups and a volatile balance between its predominantly Muslim north and Christian south. Any military action, even if initially aimed at surgically eliminating specific terrorist groups like Boko Haram, risks shattering this fragile equilibrium. The history of foreign interventions in complex societies demonstrates that what starts as a clean, targeted operation rapidly devolves into a quagmire of unintended consequences. A U.S. strike could easily be framed by local militants as a neo-colonialist aggression, serving as a powerful recruiting tool for the very radical groups Trump seeks to destroy. Furthermore, a U.S. intervention would instantly trigger systemic destabilization across West Africa. The ensuing power vacuum and collapse of order could unleash massive, uncontrolled flows of refugees and internally displaced persons, overwhelming neighboring countries that are already struggling with their own regional security issues. The military action, therefore, risks creating a humanitarian crisis of continental proportions. Tinubu's diplomatic resistance is a direct attempt to warn the U.S. against this outcome, asserting Nigeria's sovereign right to manage its own security without risking a spiral into chaos brought about by external, unsolicited military force. The political framing of the violence as a simple religious crusade is dangerously misleading and provides a thin legal veneer for an operation that carries existential risk for the stability of all of Africa.
We have analyzed the external resistance from the Nigerian government and the internal strategic goals driving Trump's threatened intervention. Now we must dissect the critical domestic risks and the precarious legal framework underpinning this operation, which together create a significant potential for political blowback within the United States. The core of this domestic turbulence is the fundamental constitutional struggle over the authority to initiate military action. Trump's plan to launch strikes against Nigeria is facing direct internal opposition from Congress, crossing traditional partisan lines. Senators from both Republican and Democratic parties have publicly expressed grave concerns and introduced resolutions specifically aimed at prohibiting the use of U.S. military force without explicit legislative approval. This pushback is a critical check on the executive branch's power, highlighting the widely held fear that Trump is setting a dangerous precedent by initiating a foreign military conflict unilaterally, bypassing the foundational war-making powers of the Congress. This political risk is immense. Any operation conducted without congressional support would face immediate legitimacy challenges and could quickly turn a military success into a prolonged constitutional crisis. Trump's administration is attempting to circumvent this constitutional constraint by aggressively leveraging existing legal frameworks, specifically the Patriot Act of 2001. The formal justification for the military action is based on the claim that the Nigerian groups responsible for the violence are foreign terrorist organizations, and that the Nigerian state is allowing the murder of Christians. By linking the issue to terrorism and the catastrophic domestic crisis of fentanyl addiction, Trump attempts to frame the intervention as a necessary defense of the homeland. However, the legal basis for this broad interpretation of the Patriot Act, using it to justify a military invasion aimed at regime coercion over a non-state terrorist group, is profoundly disputed and seen by many legal experts as highly specious. The focus on fentanyl and the need to stop the flow of the deadly opioid is a powerful domestic political narrative, but its military connection to a large-scale Nigerian intervention is tenuous, adding to the perception that the entire operation is a pre-election political gambit. The high-stakes nature of this plan ensures that Trump is facing domestic scrutiny unlike any other intervention. The public spectacle of U.S. forces engaging in combat in Africa, particularly one that quickly devolves into a costly counterinsurgery, would be a major political liability. The very senators who are questioning the legal justification of the intervention stand ready to amplify any sign of mission creep or excessive casualties. Trump is betting that a swift, surgical success will silence these critics and validate his claim as a decisive global leader. However, should the operation become bogged down, the political cost will be immediate and severe, threatening to undermine his entire domestic agenda and exposing the inherent legal and political risks of launching a war without national consensus. We have meticulously analyzed the military posturing, the dubious legal justifications, and the genuine threats of destabilization associated with Trump's interventionist stance on Nigeria. The final verdict on this situation is clear and chilling. The military threat is at its core a carefully constructed political gambit designed to achieve immediate domestic benefits and strategic economic leverage, thereby fundamentally undermining the integrity of international law. The primary driver of this crisis is Trump's singular focus on domestic political theater. Faced with mounting internal challenges, Trump is leveraging the crisis rhetoric to project an image of absolute strength and decisiveness to his voter base. By framing the intervention as a necessary crusade to save our great Christian community and stop the fentanyl plague, he appeals directly to the ideological and security fears of his most loyal constituents. This move serves a critical purpose. It redirects public attention away from the systemic domestic failures, constitutional crises, and political scandals that dog his administration. The deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford and the use of strategic bombers are, in this light, highly expensive stage props in a political drama aimed at securing the next election cycle. However, the consequences of this political opportunism are anything but trivial. The true risk to global stability is not necessarily the limited military action itself, but the cynical use of U.S. military power to achieve inside-the-beltway political goals. This sets a dangerous, destructive precedent. When the world superpower uses its military might to enforce an ideological narrative or gain a commercial advantage, it irrevocably erodes the foundational principles of national sovereignty and international law. The justification is seen by global observers not as a legitimate response to terrorism, but as a return to a destructive, destabilizing unilateralism. The most profound long-term consequence of this aggressive posture is economic. Nigeria, as Africa's largest oil producer, represents a significant prize. A successful, swift intervention would open the door for U.S. oil companies to exploit these vast resources. Crucially, the sudden influx of Nigerian crude onto the global market would inevitably depress world oil prices. This would serve as a powerful secondary strike against Vladimir Putin, whose war effort in Ukraine is entirely financed by maintaining high oil revenues. Thus, Trump's gambit, while rooted in domestic politics, carries a devastating geopolitical payoff, securing U.S. energy interests while accelerating the financial insolvency of a key global rival. Ultimately, Trump is attempting to win a political victory by betting that the strategic advantages, the access to oil, the demonstration of force, and the domestic political praise will outweigh the massive risks of destabilizing Africa's most populous nation and violating international legal norms. The verdict is a moral one. This intervention, driven by political expediency and economic ambition, poses a fundamental challenge to the global order.